Good morning, everyone. This is Jeff Meisner with Avalara. I am the Senior Developer Marketing Manager here at the company. Thanks to everyone for joining us today for our April developer webinar on building a point-of-sale integration, what developers need to know. Hosting the webinar today will be our own Bob Erdman. He's a project manager with the partner launch team. Also in the room, we have a lot of great experience and perspective. We have Mark Wilhelm, who is the director of the partner launch team, Wayne Meyer, who is a software engineer on the developer relations team, and Sarah Simwell, who is also on the partner launch team. We will spend the first 30 to 40 minutes with the presentation, and then we'll be taking questions the last 15 to 20 minutes. Throughout the webinar, please do feel free to submit questions in the question box, and I am going to turn it over to Bob. Bob, go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Hey, everybody. Pleasure to be speaking with you again today. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, point-of-sale integrations. I love these things. They're fantastic. So let's go ahead and dive in. So with the point-of-sale integrations, we really have two models that we can support with. There's of course, the connected model. That's where you're going to dynamically call the AvaTax service anytime you need a tax calculation. So very simple. When someone comes up to the register, they give you your items, you scan them in, you call the service to get that tax subtotal. They agree with it. Everything's great. You go ahead and process the transaction, and we want to record that transaction. So that follows kind of the typical AvaTax model for either point of sale or even like an e-commerce checkout, however that works. We also support for those point of sale systems that aren't connected to the internet. We supported the disconnected model where we provide you the tax content that would allow the the point of sale system to natively calculate the tax within its own engine. There are some caveats with that. There's some functionality that you lose out on. But the key there with that one is we do support it, and you can provide the tax calculation for the end users. And then we also want to make sure we capture those offline transactions so that merchant can properly remit. So first we're going to dive into the connected model, talk a bit about the connected model, the features, functionalities there. Then we'll talk a little bit about the the disconnected model, the offline calculation process.
Hey, Bob, the audio is apparently extremely soft, so maybe just come in a little bit. Speak a little bit louder.
Is that a little better? Check. 1, 2, 1, 2. Everybody hear me good? Okay, perfect. So let's go shopping. So on the connected model, we're going to start here with my sample store. I've got it located in New York City, and my sample store sells burlap sack clothing, because why not? Clothing items are going to range from $50 to $200, and we'll talk a little bit about why that price is important here in a minute. So over on the right here, we see this is what the dynamic request to AvaTax is going to look like to get a calculation back. So you can see we have the line. So this is the items that we're purchasing. Lines are obviously numbered. The quantity is also important here. So we've got a quantity of 1 with an amount of $50. We've got the item code, and we've got the item description. Now that tax code is important because that tax code is going to tell the AvaTax engine what the item is, and there's some special taxability rules that we're going to get into here in a minute. The type is important. The sales order type tells the tax engine that this is just a quote. So this is the point where customers come up to the register, they want to scan in the item to see what is my total out the door cost going to be. So at this point, we don't want to record a transaction to AvaTax. We just want to get a tax quote in the calculation. So that's what that sales order type is telling us. The company code here is specific to the company profile on the AvaTax account where we're processing a transaction. So this is processing against my Bob code company. The date, of course, is going to be the date of the transaction, so that should default to the current date. And the address, this is where we differ from, say, an e-commerce transaction where we have both an origin and a destination. Because we're at a point-of-sale transaction, it's a single location. So we only need to pass in the single address type. So we've got, our address there, 20 West 34th Street. Anybody know which address that is?
No.
That's the Empire State Building.
They sell stuff at the Empire State Building?
Burlap sack clothing, I'm hoping.
They're burlap sack clothing.
Burlap sack clothing, yeah. Exactly.
I'm not buying it, Bob.
You're not buying it? Yeah. People, it's a hard sell with burlap sack clothing. So once we process the transaction, we're going to get back a tax result. And here, let me quickly pop over and show you what that tax result is going to look like. So again, we have our same request here, and if we process this transaction, we're going to call the Avatax service, and it's going to come back and it's going to give us the total tax. Here is kind of the key value, but as you can see, we return an awful lot of information. So if I jump back over to the presentation, where I really wanted to zero in on was underneath the line of the response, we're going to break out the total tax calculation by jurisdiction. So within New York, we have 3 taxing jurisdictions. We have the New York State, which has the rate of 4%. We can see that no tax is calculated on this particular transaction. We'll get to that in just a second. We have the city tax at 4.5%, again, no tax. And then the special tax for New York, which is at 0.375%. Now, we didn't get a tax calculation on, or we didn't get a tax amount return on this transaction because of the type of transaction it was. So if we actually come back here to our previous slide, this is where, let me get my highlighter. This is where the code, tax code comes into play. So within the state of New York, there are special taxability rules around clothing. Clothing is only taxable if the item is over $110. So because our item was $50, we didn't get a tax calculation back.
Even if it's made out of burlap?
Even if it's made out of burlap.
Okay.
Very, burlap, it's the unsung hero of clothing.
It's in this season.
It is, it's up and coming.
Didn't it go out like in the Middle Ages, actually?
What's old is new again.
Exactly.
What's
coming,
really,
it's coming back
really
around,
old is new
yeah.
again.
So perhaps we don't want the $50 low-end burlap sack. We want the high end, the high quality burlap sack. So we're going to come back to a store. We're going to put our old burlap sack cloth shirt back. We're going to get the high quality one, which is of course a desaturated burlap sack. And we're going to go back into the register. This time, still same one item, one quantity, amounts now $150. And of course, we're changing the SKU, and we've got the different description here. It's still clothing, so it still says that same tax code applies. Because we're still just quoting, we're still at a sales order document type. Still processing, it's the same company code, still the same date, still the same customer code, and still the same location. However, this time, when we process the order, we're actually going to get tax because that item was over the threshold. So this time we can see that New York State came back with $6 in tax. The New York City tax came back with $6.75, and the special tax came back with about 50 cents. So the total item cost worked out about $163 and some change. So that's the quote that you can provide the customer. The customer then has the option to, okay, yeah, you know what? I do want the high quality burlap sack, or you know what? Forget it. I'm going to walk away and don't. So in the event that the customer does purchase, great, we're going to tender the sale, take the cash, and off we go. So what does that mean for the merchant recording the transaction? Well, this is where we want, now that we've made the sale, we want to record that transaction in the Avatax account so that the merchant can later do some accurate reporting on it. So like we said before, the tax estimates use that sales order document type. Once the transaction is finalized, we're going to want to make another request to the Avatax service. And this time we're going to want to use the sales invoice document type. So we can see here that the line information, nothing has changed on that. Still the same quantity, still the same amount, still the same date. The only things we're changing here on the request are the type, the commit, and the code. So the type is going to record this transaction to the merchant's Avatax account for later reporting and remittance. Commit is going to make that transaction on the Avatax account finalized. And the code is going to be important because up to this point, we've only been doing calculation quotes. At this point, once the sale is tendered and finalized, you're going to have an ID from the POS system. We're going to want to make sure we mark this transaction with the corresponding transaction ID so that the merchant can later reconcile.
Well, yeah, and the reason why it's important that it's recorded is so that when it's filed, that we've got a collection of those. If you left the other doc type, it wouldn't be included in the file. Exactly.
So that's where it's very important that at the point of the transaction workflow, we do the quote after the transaction or the sale is complete. We want to record and commit that transaction to the merchant's Avatax account. And once the transaction is recorded, we can do a lot of things with it. We'll get to refunds here, but you can fetch that transaction if you need to see, hey, what was that transaction? If your process is where you have a posting process at the end of the day. You don't record any of the transactions. You don't finalize any of those transactions till the end of the day. You have the option to record the transaction using the doc type of sales invoice, but you can leave that commit value false. Then at the end of the day, when you're going through and reconciling your day's books or you're cashing out your drawer, once you complete that process, you can go through and hit a process to go back, fetch all those transactions that were completed during the day, and then commit them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Bob, I don't know if this is coming further along, and you can stop me if it is, but, you know, if you're doing a point-of-sale application and there's lots of different locations, can you talk a little bit about aggregating that together and being able to identify which location that is?
Oh, as far as the passing a location code with the transaction? Yeah, so in the event where you have multiple store locations, you certainly want to use the address type of single location for each physical address store. If you have multiple address stores, you can also leverage a field in AvaTax called the reporting location code that will bucket the transactions for a given location, you know, store A versus store B appropriately. So all the transactions that happen in store A, we can identify by the reporting location code as happened in store A versus all the transactions that happen in store B and store B. So all those transactions still aggregate under one AvaTax account, but you have the visibility and reporting to see the transaction from store A versus store B. Perfect. So we bought our burlap sack, we take it home, we try it on. We obviously do not like the feeling of burlap clothing, so we're going to want to return that guy. So when we refund a transaction, we've actually got a really easy way to process refunds. We have an API specifically for refunds. The information we need to process a refund using the API is the company code of the original transaction and what that original transaction ID was. So that's why it's very important if you're going to leverage this API. We also record and commit those transactions with the appropriate dot code or the identifier from the POS system. There's options within the refund API to process a full refund. I'm going to return the shirt, or if I bought multiple items, I can return one or more line items from a specific transaction. Or if I just wanted to provide it's a burlap shirt, maybe you're complaining about it, I just want to give you kind of a 50% discount or a 50% refund, keep the item.
No, full refund.
Full refund. Well, you also have the option for a percentage refund.
Okay.
Now, if you're not going to, that's just one of the many ways we can process a refund. If you wanted to do a refund manually, you certainly have that option. So let's pop over to the Postman collection here and take a look and see what that looks like. So if you're going to process a refund, you can see here over on the left, it is very similar to the get text request. As a matter of fact, it has all the same elements, just with a couple additions. So at the top, we still have the line information that we're returning. You can see here that we have a positive quantity, but a negative extended amount. That's the negative value that's coming in. Oh, Wayne, I don't know if I can zoom in.
Control plus.
Oh, let me see if I can control plus. Oh, Wayne, you're a genius. All right, better? Okay, it looks good. Okay, so we're still utilizing the same tax code to process the refund on the item. We want to make sure we follow the same taxability rules as the original transaction. We're still going to pass in the description. What we see here down at the bottom is a tax override. So this is very important for someone that's purchasing an item and then returning it several days later. So we're going to process the refund and record the refund transaction using the current date. So that's the current tax date. However, we want to use the tax override tax date value of the original invoice date to calculate that refund amount. So the scenario is I go buy a burlap shirt for Christmas, for my kid. Great, give it to them on Christmas, they hate it.
Big surprise.
Big surprise. Nobody likes the burlap shirt gift. So we go in January, we go back to the store to return it. However, between Christmas and when we return the item, the tax rate of that location may have changed. So what the tax override tax date value does is it informs the tax engine to calculate the refund tax amount using the original tax tables from that time when the original purchase was made. Now the type here, we're going to set that to return order, return invoice. So it follows the same logical path as providing a quote or recording a transaction. A return order provides you that quote of what your total refund will be if you still want to return the item. Whereas when they return the item, you hand them the cash back. That's when we want to record that transaction using the return invoice doc type. to the Avatax account.
Can you talk a little bit also about the relevance of dot code and best practices?
Yeah, so with the dot code, that's going to be the identifier for the transaction within the Avatax account. So what we're looking for, and we want to make sure, is that there's a corresponding value, whatever you identify the transactions, however you identify the transactions within your POS system, we want to have that corresponding value identified on the transactions within Avatax. So if you identify with your invoicing or invoice number 123, we want to set that transaction code as 123. All right, we clear on all that stuff? Awesome. Perfect. So we do have a link here for the refund transaction API documentation. I do highly encourage everybody to go take a look at it and check it out. It's, I think, one of our better features. Now, in the event that you're doing B2B transactions, you've got customers who may be exempt from sales tax. How do we handle that with Avatax and the connected service and the dynamic calls? We actually have a variety of ways to handle that. So we have an application called CertCapture, which helps merchants manage their customers' exemption certificates. CertCapture synchronizes with Avatax. CertCapture has a mobile scan app, so while you're standing at the register and someone comes up and they happen to have an exemption certificate on hand, you can take a photo of it right there and they get that link to their customer record. Isn't it cool? Isn't it really cool? There's also, there's also an application that you can leverage during the checkout process where the customer doesn't happen to have the exemption certificate on hand for them to take a photo of. They can dynamically generate an exemption certificate through a website application, web app, and link that to their customer record account. Once the certificate is linked to a customer account within CertCapture, that customer's information is synchronized to Avatax, and then Avatax can identify the customer who's exempt. Now,
where we found that many times I've had questions come up about, well, why would I need that in a retail setting? Some very common use cases that we see are at places like Lowe's or hardware parts and supplies, where I might come in on the weekend, do my weekend warrior, and buy some supplies from Lowe's or a similar type of hardware store. But on a daily basis, you have to keep in mind that they have contractors, general contractors, construction companies that are coming in, and many times are purchasing these for either construction purposes, which could have an exemption associated with them. I could be purchasing it for resale to the person that I'm installing to. And so these type of hardware stores, parts and supply stores, have a heavy demand for this, especially when I have a net new contractor showing up and saying, well, I should be exempt. I now have an automated way to document their request, build a certificate if they don't have one, which many times they do not, and get all the documentation in place that keeps me safe from an audit.
Yep, exactly.
So
Also big box stores, those warehouse stores, Costco, et cetera, Sam's Club. You go in, you buy stuff for your own goods, but then you might buy stuff to resell at your convenience store. Mm-hmm. So lots of applications here. So when you're utilizing the CertCapture integration, the key value that Avatax is going to look to identify the exempt customer is going to be the customer code field. As a matter of fact, let's pop back here to one of our previous requests. And that's where this customer code, where'd it go? This customer code value comes in handy. So this would be someone registered with your application. So they're a known user. So when they come to the store, you've identified them as an exempt customer. You're going to pass that customer code value to Avatax. As long as Avatax has a corresponding record of this customer code with an exemption certificate on file, we'll consider that transaction exempt. Now, in the case where you don't want to leverage the CertCapture application, but you just want to identify customers who are exempt from your own application, that functionality also exists. So let's pop over here to Postman once again and take a look at what that looks like. So here we can see within the request over on the left, I've got one additional field here to the quote order. That is our customer usage type field. And the value I've passed in here is G, and what that equates to within Avatax is a reseller. So if I process this transaction, we're going to see that no tax is calculated, even though the amount and the tax code for the state of New York break that taxability threshold. So if I go ahead and just remove this line and process the transaction again, we do see that tax was calculated. So there is the functionality there for within your POS system. If you've got a function to identify customers who have a card or whatnot registered within the system, and you've already collected their exemption certificates on file, you can identify those customers as exempt when making a dynamic tax call to Avatax.
Is it best practice to capture both of that information, or is one more relevant than the other?
You know, from a compliance perspective, I'd go with the cert capture application and that integration point. That's going to ensure that you have the active valid exemption certificate on file anytime that customer makes a transaction. So if that exemption certificate happens to lapse, say it expires at the end of December, that customer comes in on January 2nd, if you weren't on top of it and making sure that the information was accurate and up to date within your system, you might exempt that customer from sales tax. However, with the cert capture application, we will automatically end that exemption identification upon the certificate's expiration.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob, we have two questions.
Sure.
So Nathan Woolridge asks, is there a process to follow with customers who are self-assessing their own taxes?
As far as self-assessing.
So you're talking about, because you're talking about right now, Bob, the connected model, correct?
I'm talking about the connected model.
And we will, and the next section that we'll be talking about is the disconnected, where Avalara provides tax content and allows the local engine or the local tax solution and the point of sale solution to calculate tax using that. So that may be.
Yeah, that may be. Nathan, if that's if that's the context of your question, hang tight, is coming. If not, please reply and we'll do our best to address it. Okay.
And then the next question is, why don't we use a exemption directly with entity use code? This is from Raymond R.
Could you repeat the question, Jeff?
Yeah. It says, why don't use exemption directly with entity use code?
So the customer usage type example that I provided exemption reasons. So we have a set list of exempt reasons that provide different taxability treatments. So the example I used was reseller. However, in California, if you're not exempt for the purpose of resale, but you're exempt for the purpose of industrial manufacture, you're actually not fully tax exempt. You're just taxed at a reduced rate. So by identifying why you're exempt instead of just your exemption number is going to get you a better tax calculation.
Okay.
And
then
and I think maybe the clarification on that is there are several methods by which in a connected or dynamic tax calculation request that you can trigger an exemption. Passing the specific entity use code, whether it be G for resale or E for charitable organization, et cetera, that's always an option, as well as using the cert capture solution. So it's not you have to use cert capture or you can only use entity use code. There are several options depending on what the merchant's needs. And typically what we see is merchants that have like supply houses, industrial supply houses that may do retail sales as well as having, as I said, contractors come in. They're going to probably lean toward a cert capture solution because they have a lot more activity in that exempt area and accordingly a lot more exposure that they want to try to diminish the level of exposure by using automation. Those that have a smaller customer base that is have exemptions, in those scenarios we might see the manual passing of the entity use code or customer usage type to trigger the exemption. So it's really looking at what the merchant's needs are and the level of exemption activity that you might be having.
And when you talk about exposure, you're talking about audit exposure. If you have tons of exemptions, there's some extra attention into that part
Correct.
of the audit.
And because anytime, one of the most commonly audited areas, especially for merchants, is, first of all, they look at, are you taxing your products correctly? Making sure that taxable products are taxable. But quite honestly, the biggest area where an auditor can come in and find uncollected funds is finding transactions that have been exempted but do not have the supporting exemption documentation. And accordingly, the higher the volume that you have, as you would expect of exempt customers, the more time and effort that they're going to put in there, and the better that a cert capture automation solution will help you mitigate that risk.
And
sorry, go ahead, Wayne.
I can actually add a little bit of context, some more context to Ray's question, some clarification. Customer's usage type and entity use code are the same within the REST API. We have deprecated customer usage type. The field still works, and so the examples are indeed valid, but there will be additional notification as we're approaching disconnecting that field. It has been replaced with entity use code. So why use entity use code? That's the future. But customer usage type does currently work.
Okay, three follow-up questions around exemptions. So for a tax-exempt entity, what tax treatment difference is there between different exempt codes, entity use codes?
So there is a matrix on our help center that's going to spell that out. Unfortunately,
I'll find that.
You can find that. Okay, perfect. You can find that link and we can get it to you. But it does come down to that example of the treatment of why you're exempt impacting whether or not you're fully exempt or you're partially exempt. So the example of California industrial manufacturers are not fully exempt. They're taxed at, I believe, 2.75%, as opposed to the 6 or 7 to 9% taxes, depending on where you are in the state of California. Whereas retailers within California are fully exempt. So having that exempted reason provides you that better tax calculation. We also have another field in addition to the entity use code / customer usage type, which I'm not supposed to use anymore. In my examples, we do have an exemption number field. I like to consider this one kind of the nuclear option. Any string value passed in the exemption number field on a dynamic tax request is going to consider the transaction exempt from sales tax. So you lose that granular taxability on the reason why you're exempt. You're just going to be exempt, period.
Okay, and then Raymond also asks, why use Cert Express?
So the Cert Express application is the one that allows you to, at the point of sale, if you don't have that exemption certificate with you, but you happen to have your exemption number, your state-assigned exemption ID, you can create that exemption certificate dynamically on the fly. It provides that merchant the backing documentation that they need to provide you an exempt tax calculation at the time of checkout.
Okay, and then Melissa Maddie asks, how can the point-of-sale API support B2B sales where exemption certificates on file in cert capture or are being collected at the point of sale needs to apply only to certain items being purchased?
So that's going to be within the point of sale application. We can identify whether or not the customer or the entire document is exempt by passing the exemption ID at the header level, or we can pass the exemption ID at the line level. Now on the reverse of that, if the customer purchasing an item is exempt from tax and you need to make certain lines on that transaction taxable, there's an override value that you can pass in that entity use code field that would override the customer level exemption and provide a tax calculation on, say, lines 1 and 2, but lines 3 and 4 would remain exempt from sales tax. So lots of flexibility within the system on how to tax or not tax an exempt customer. All right.
Nice.
We address those questions, Jeff?
That's everything so far.
Everything so far?
Yeah.
You should have the link, Jeff.
I just put it in the chat box.
Wonderful.
Perfect. Okay. Lastly here, I know we touched on this with the Newark example with the Burlap sack clothing, but product taxability. So we've talked a bit about product taxability and how passing an Avatax tax code with the transaction impacts whether or not you're going to get a tax calculation or not. We don't just have a tax code for burlap sack clothing. We have a lot of tax codes. we maintain over 2,000 product and service taxability codes. So we want to make sure that when you're going through and setting up this point of sale system, we're identifying what are the products or services that you're providing at that location, and make sure that we pop over here to this website that we have, the taxcode.avatax.avalara.com. Oh, it looks like I got a typo in the URL there. We'll adjust that and send it out. But make sure that we find a corresponding tax code that covers the products or services that you're selling. Now, if we don't happen to have a tax code, maybe you've got something very unique that has some very unique taxability treatments, merchants have the ability within an Avatax account to create a custom tax code and provide custom tax rules behind that code. So again, a lot of flexibility within the system, similar to exemptions on providing a taxability treatment to a customer. We provide the similar functionality for product taxability, product and service taxability. All right, so let's talk a bit about the disconnected model. So with the disconnected model, we've got some setup requirements within the Avatax account, and we lose a little bit of functionality by processing this model. So like we were talking about before, this is providing tax content to the POS system. So we can provide some level of product taxability. We lose the exemption functionality. So because we're not connected to Avatax, we're not looking up to see, is a customer exempt from sales tax? Do they have an exemption certificate on file? That's going to have to be maintained within the POS system. So the configuration required on the Avatax account to get this tax content responsive, first off, we have to have Nexus turned on in the states where you have retail locations. Speaking of the retail locations, we need to set up locations within the Avatax company profile for each store. And then we have to identify the product taxability codes that cover the items being sold in your store. So back to my Burlap sack clothing company. I've got Nexus turned on in New York. I've got my company code, BOBCO, that identifies the company profile within the Avatax account. I've got the date for which I want the tax content. So in this case, I'm getting the tax content at the time I wrote it was the 16th, but you're going to want to make that the date you want the tax for. And then the response type, we've got here JSON. I believe, Wayne, we've got a couple different formats, comes back JSON or CSV.
Yes.
And then the tax code and then the location. So my location now, instead of passing in the address for the New York State building, I've set up a location within Avatax called New York ESP, which then has an address of that 34 West 34th Street. So we're going to send this request over to Avatax, and Avatax is going to come back with a scenario for each location plus tax code combination. So my request only results in one scenario, but if I had more locations or more tax codes, I'd see more scenarios.
So that's what content means, right? It's the rate and the product taxability.
Correct. Correct. So we're going to have the location plus product taxability is going to give you the content scenario.
Okay.
So we have one scenario, and like before, we're going to send back a lot of information. With the tax content, we're only going to send you back the little snippets. So for each location plus tax code, and the jurisdictions that cover that location, we're going to send you back the rate information. So here we can see that the New York State rate is 4%. The New York City rate is 4.5%. And the tax rate for the Special Metropolitan Transit District is, 0.375%. Now, the thing here that I want to point out is we have a cap and threshold, which are rules that the POS system is going to need to interpret on when to apply the tax. So for our example with New York, the tax code up here, the PC 040, let me get the highlighter back on, PC 040100, tax is only applied if the item passes the threshold of $110. Now we also have a note here for the tax rule option. It says tax all. What that indicates is the entire amount becomes taxable once it passes that threshold. And that's across the board for everything. So when we're processing these requests, we're going to send you back the taxability information for each location, and this information is going to vary. So let's look at a couple other examples if our store was in some different states. So if our store was in Massachusetts, we send in the same request. You can see the similar request here, company, date, how I want the information back, what the tax code is, and now the location now has changed to Massachusetts. So we can see in Massachusetts, we get the rate of 6.25%, but now we have a threshold of $175. So it differs from New York. And also there's no tax all on this. So what does that mean? That means only the amount over $175 becomes taxable. So if I had a clothing item, so again, still here the same clothing tax code. If I had a clothing item that was $200, only $25 of that item becomes taxable. So that's something that the POS system is going to need to interpret and apply correctly, because we're just going to be able to provide this tax content. It's going to be up to the developer to take this tax content and convert it into the native POS engine. So now, we've only talked a bit about thresholds, so let's talk a little bit about caps. So we move our store down to Florida. And within Florida, we've got this concept of a cap on the tax. So we can see here for the state, we're getting the rate of 6%, and there's no cap or threshold on the state. So we're going to apply whatever the total cost is for the state rate at 6% across the board. However, for counties in Florida, they've capped the tax at $5,000. So only the burlap sack that's $10,000, only the first $5,000 of that burlap sack cloth is taxable at the county rate.
You gotta give up this business. Nobody wants your burlap.
You know what? It's coming back around. I'm telling you.
Hey, Bob, we have a question from Raymond again. Is the threshold for all transactions in the state or per each individual sale?
So this is per location, per sale.
And it is actually a single item threshold for Massachusetts and New York, meaning if Bob priced his burlap sack clothing at, let's say at $60 a piece, and somebody bought two, so I have a $120 line with a quantity of two. What that would actually equate to is my single item price is $60. That falls under the $110 New York threshold, and the entire $120 would be non-taxable or exempt. A single item that, let's say Bob's premium burlap sack clothing, is actually, for one item is $130 for the single item. That $130 would be fully taxable. So you actually have to look at the single item price. So you have to take the total price for that item divided by the quantity. That comes up with the single item price, and then you make the determination, is that above or below the threshold? And then accordingly, apply the tax content as needed.
So the answer is categorically, it depends.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. So I just did an example here within Postman where we changed the quantity of that New York transaction from 1 to 2, and it did just exactly what Mark explained. It brought that per item price down beneath the threshold, and we can see that tax was not assessed. All right, so we've talked about Massachusetts, we've talked about New York, we've talked about Florida, then we can get on to my favorite location to have a retail establishment, Tennessee. Because Tennessee is fantastically unique in that they have an additional state tax that has both a cap and a threshold. So what we can see here is when we process that request to Tennessee, just like we did for Massachusetts, we're just changing location. We're getting back 4 different jurisdictions in our scenario. So the state tax, we can see that the 7%, just like Florida, has no cap, no threshold. It always applies. However, there's this additional state tax of 2.75% that only applies when a single item is above $1,600, but less than $3,200. And then again, with the county and the city, we also have that cap here where that county and city tax only applies to those items up to $1,600. So we can see here with even with the tax content, there's a lot of complexity that the developer is going to have to overcome in interpreting these results and converting them into the native POS tax engine. So again, with the two systems, the dynamic calls, if you're always connected, great, you can just make those requests. However, if you're disconnected, you have a need to pull down that tax content. You're going to have to look through the content results and make sure that we can translate them into the native POS engine. So once you're in the native POS engine, you're going to do the same process. You'll do your calculation natively. You'll do your tender, your sale, you record it. But then what happens on getting that transaction activity up to the Avatax account so that that merchant can remit? We've got two methods on what we can do. It's the same process, just functionally coming into us two different ways. We have an import transaction template that would need to be populated. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and I've got a link there to the Help Center article that has the details on that. Essentially, we want to populate the transaction import template with the transaction activity of the day. And then your options are to have the merchant, manually upload that through the Avatax UI, or you can utilize if you wanted to take that responsibility out of the merchant's hands and make it a nightly process, there's an API that you can leverage to do that, and that's our batch endpoint. To take that same transaction spreadsheet, formats it into an API request, you send up the batch, and it's an asynchronous process, so you have to send up the batch, get back the batch ID, poll on that batch ID to see what the status is. Once Avatax finishes processing that result, or processes that batch, you'll be able to pull down the result file to make sure that all your transactions were imported successfully.
Both those options work. Is there a reason why somebody would pick one option or the other?
For me, automating things is always better.
Yeah.
So taking it out of somebody's responsible hands to say, you're responsible at the end of the day as you're closing out the register to go in and generate this file and then upload it to Avatax. If you can automate that process to when they're shutting down the service and closing the store down for the night, it does it for them, and then calls the service to get the next day's tax rates. That's important. So, and that actually brings up another point I wanted to make here on these tax requests. The document date is very important. We're going to send you back the tax calculation for that date. So a best practice would be to call the service every night to get the next day's tax information. This will allow you to capture things like tax holidays. So if you're selling school supplies happens to be one of your tax codes. If you're having a tax holiday over the weekend, on Friday night when you close down your register and you make that request for Saturday's tax rates, if a tax holiday happens to be in place, you're going to get a backer rate information of 0 for that particular product tax code. And I believe that just about wraps it up. So we do have a bunch of resources here for you. So if you found this helpful, please check out the Quick Start Guide on point of sale for developers. We've got that link there. I highly recommend heading over to our interactive demo. I think it's fantastic. So if you want to check out what the Avatax service looks like as far as the API request and response, that's fantastic. If you're ready to build an integration, you want to dive in and get your feet wet, you can head over to our developer.avalara.com and sign up for a 60-day free production trial. And we have our annual Crush conference coming up here. Is that next month?
It is.
Yeah.
Next month.
A few weeks
away, yeah. So if you haven't already signed up for Crush, that is a phenomenal experience and a great, just a great event.
Well, there's a full developer track.
Absolutely. Yeah. Full developer track, so you can certainly hang out with us and ask all the questions and get all the answers.
Great. We have 2 questions. Sorry, go ahead, Wayne.
Oh, I wanted to. You mentioned some resources here. I'd like to take a moment to plug the Avatax SDKs. We maintain and release these in lockstep with the REST API, and we're always adding new functionality. For example, one of the new bits of functionality we're going to be adding into the SDKs are local tax content and tax rates by zip code. Built into the SDKs so that you can adapt them and use them so that you talk about that disconnected state. That's going to be built into the Avatax SDKs. Give that information right back to you.
Oh, fantastic.
Use that development pane.
That's awesome.
Great, we have 2 questions. So Raymond R., he is just full of questions today. I'm loving it.
Go, Raymond.
Yes, thank you.
So Raymond asks, can you allow the batch API to automatically commit document codes sent in bulk to verify API, the one by invitation only?
No. So when processing the transactions via batch, it's simply going to take the information that was pre-calculated. So with that batch processing, we're going to take the transactions plus the tax that was natively calculated within the POS system and record that to Avatax. So as a tax liability, you've already incurred tax calculation, it's already done outside of AvaTax, and we want to record those transactions for further reports and remittance.
Great. And then Sandeep Khanna asks, are there any out-of-the-box integrations for point-of-sale systems?
Absolutely there are. I'd have to get a list together, but we have quite a few that have both the dynamic and disconnected calls pre-built into them. For a complete list, though, what we can do is I can pull that together, and we can do perhaps a reply with the attendees.
Could we send them to the integrations page and they could do a search there?
Yep. I know we've been doing some work on that on the Avalara.com page.
Because there's about 700 connectors across a variety of use case scenarios.
Everything from ERP to e-commerce to point of sale. Yeah, they're all included on that listing. If you are developing an AvaTax integration, I would encourage you to connect with the partner program to make sure you get the resources of this team to help you build out your integration and make it ready for onboarding multiple merchants.
Okay. I'm sending this information to Sandeep right now. And I'm going to also send him the partner page link on DevDot. Great. Let's see. So, folks, we still have a couple of minutes left for questions, if you have any. So while we're waiting for questions, we have a lot of gray matter in the room here. Do you guys want to talk a little bit more about what we have on tap for developers at Crush? Maybe talk about the sessions that we'll have there. I know there's an intro to the developer stack, the intro to the Avalara stack. There's something on marketplaces.
Here we go. Ready? So there is the whole developer track is organized with the underlying theme of omni-channel selling. So it starts off with an introduction to the Avalara stack, but then it goes through the different elements of omni-channel selling. So we do look at marketplaces, we do look at use tax, we do look at landed cost. So it starts with an intro to the Avalara stack. We look at the different components that's involved in omni-channel selling. There is an omni-channel capstone that just really pulls it all together about the service being able to aggregate transaction information for a complete filing cycle. And then the last is a Q&A session. And the thing that I really like about the developer track is that we have specifically selected the presenters to be all-encompassing for the audience. So there is a technical expert, very, very, very familiar with the API. There is a compliance expert who is there, and then also there is a solution designer. So thinking about the full spectrum of questions, we really brought the team to be able to answer those. Did that answer your question, Jeff?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
We have a couple more questions. One question I'm going to actually ask the attendee to rephrase because I'm not quite understanding it. But another question we have is from Steve Fogelson. Steve asks, I have questions for website integrations. Where do you recommend resources and contacts for that? I would say developer.avalara.com.
Developer.avalara.com, yeah. So on there, Steve, if you click under I believe it's under AvaTax, there's a developer guide link. That's probably a great spot to get started. I think our API documentation is some of the best out there, so certainly dive into the API documentation.
We've heard a lot of people say that.
Yeah, and for sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, yeah, and then that demo. I just wanted to tag on that demo is probably the best, beyond the developer guide. If you're just looking for a quick introduction to how AvaTax responds to a tax request, that demo is going to be perfect for you.
And if you have outstanding engineering questions after that, or even you want some entry point into your questions that you have, we have the developer forums, also accessible on developer.avalara.com. My team monitors those forums, and we generally try to get a turnaround within the same day.
Yeah, that's a great point, Wayne.
Okay, yeah, and then one other thing I would add is the quick start guide that we reference, especially if it's a point of sale integration.
Absolutely.
That will provide you the kind of basic steps and endpoints that you need to build an integration. Okay, so we have another question from Maria May, and she asks, how does the system work if the company offers services? And then she also says, we don't have a single point of sale.
Oh, okay. So for that, that's where, so we have multiple address types. We have origin address types, destination address types. In the examples today, since it was just a point of sale specific talk, the place where the transaction takes place was a single address location. So that's why we leverage that. However, for services, typically services also end up, utilizing the service address as both the origin and destination. So you can certainly use that single address type. Also important to note, Jeff, I think it's an edge case or probably a niche use case for POS transactions, but food trucks. If you're in a food truck or some kind of mobile, selling operation, and you don't have a specific address on where that location is going to be, the Avalara service does accept latitude and longitude coordinates in lieu of an address.
Cool.
So if I'm driving around and selling tools out of the back of my pickup truck, I can certainly fire up a mobile application to swipe the card and leverage the geolocation coordinates instead of the physical address of where I'm at.
Great. And we have another question from Raymond. I'm loving the super engaged audience here. What's the difference between tax date and document date? Which one should we query for to get a list for reconciliation?
So by default, when you're making a sale transaction, the sale date or the date you post the transaction, that's going to also be the tax date. The tax date really comes in to play when we're talking about a refund scenario, where we want to post the refund transaction in the current period, but we want to use a tax table value, the tax table is from a previous date. So that's that example where I'm returning something I purchased in December, but I'm returning it in January. In January, where I'm recording that return transaction to my GL, I want to use the tax tables from back in December when that original purchase was made. So that's where we use that tax date, tax override value in that refund scenario.
Gotcha. And then Maria May asks, does the system work with zip codes and also geocodes, or one or the other?
So the minimum information we need to provide a tax calculation is going to be a city, state, and zip combo, with at least two of those three values being correct. Now, the best thing and the most accurate way to get a tax calculation is to send us the full address or the latitude, longitude coordinates, like I said.
And Avalara does not make use of geocoding. Our technology for dynamic tax calculations is based upon geospatial mapping. Essentially what we do during the tax calculation request is we take that address and we actually convert that address into a lat-long coordinate, and then we find the tax jurisdiction boundary maps that intersect that point. So we don't ask that you, or there is no requirement that you pre-assign a geocode or any other data element to the address. Just provide us with the address or the elements of the address that you have, and the Avalara service takes it from there.
Okay, I'm going to do a last call for questions. We have about 7 minutes left. We can end early if there are no more questions, but is there anything else we want to, kind of final thoughts we want to leave our audience with today?
Head over to developer.avalara.com and try it out. So check out that demo, sign up for the 60-day production trial.
And the last thing I might throw in is, in addition to the traditional point of sale solutions that many of us are familiar with, where you go up to the counter and ring out, the Avalara service actually has been integrated into quite a few of the mobile POS. So those merchants in retail that have decided to empower their sales associates with handheld devices, tablets, phones, what have you, to make checkout easier. We also integrate into many of those varieties of applications as well.
Okay, and then Maria May asks, picking into your sales tax expertise, will California sales tax at the district level calculate with sales of TPP and also services? She says her company offers both.
Yeah, if you select the correct tax code for your item. TPP, that's the default tax code. If you actually don't enter a tax code in your transaction, it'll calculate for TPP. Services, you really want to make sure you choose the correct tax code for your service, because, for example, software as a service in Illinois or Chicago, that's its own tax code and has a different set of rules. So yes, we can calculate for TPP and services based on the tax code that you use. And thanks for pulling that up, Bob.
Yeah, that's where that product taxability website comes in real handy. And again, that's taxcode.avatax.avalara.com.
And then we've got a content team that keeps that up to date.
Yep.
Because laws shift.
There's a lot of product taxability changes in a lot of jurisdictions all the
Yeah.
time. So yeah, no, it's handy. If you can find a code that suits your needs, absolutely leverage one of the Avalara ones.
Mm-hmm.
If there's some nuances in there, you certainly have the flexibility to make some changes to how that rule is interpreted within your own account.
Okay, and then we have time for a couple more questions. Raymond says, settle allows to verify and commit. Can it do commit when verify is good?
So Raymond, I'd ask you, is this in reference to the dynamic calculation or the offline calculation? So within the dynamic calculation.
Online, he says online.
Yeah, so within the dynamic calculation, yeah, absolutely. You can leverage the verify process, because that's it. During that checkout flow, we're providing a quote and recording the transaction at the time the purchase is made. You can certainly come back later and utilize that verify function.
And then he had one more question. Can you only commit when verify passed when calling settle transaction, or will it commit regardless when asked in the same call?
So yeah, you can commit regardless. So in that call, if you wanted to record the document with the type sales invoice, that's going to record the document to the Avatax account uncommitted. You certainly at that same time can record the transaction with the commit flag equals true. So as per my example, or you can come back by at a later time and commit the previously posted transaction using one of the many APIs that we have to do so.
Okay, and then Raymond asks, what is point of committing when verify fail at the same time?
So the verify would be to verify that the tax within your system matches the tax within the Avatax. So if there's a disconnect there, we certainly want to address that. If there's not a disconnect, we can certainly just commit the transaction, make it ready for reporting and remittance.
Raymond says it's too late when it's committed. It's the same as settle.
So if there's any problem with the committed transaction, we certainly provide the ability to adjust that transaction, and that's a different API request to adjust an existing committed Avatax transaction. With that request, we do require some audit documentation. Why are we adjusting previously committed transaction? But we do provide that flexibility to do just about anything that you can do within your point of sale application or your ERP application, you can reflect within the Avatax account.
Yeah.
As long as it's not locked.
Yeah.
I.e. reported to your Department of Revenue, that transaction is eligible for adjustment and editing.
Raymond asks, can we uncommit before adjusting committed?
Yeah, Raymond, it sounds like you've got some
Yeah.
very specific documentation workflows. So, I'd encourage you to look through the kind of the developer site, post some questions on the forum with maybe some use case examples of what you're trying to achieve with your document workflow and what API requests would come alongside you to support that.
Yeah, Raymond, because we're almost at time, I'm going to put I'm going to send you the URL to the help forums.
Yeah, but great questions, Raymond.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you, everybody. Great questions, great job, Bob. Thanks to everyone in the room for attending and sharing your expertise. Next month, we will have a webinar on building tax integrations for ERP systems, and Mark Wilhelm will be the presenter there. Great. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.